Hello, everyone, and welcome back to chesslecture.com. My name is Dana Mackenzie, and the topic I'm going to talk about today is the king is a fighting piece. This is one of my favorite sayings in chess. It was attributed to the first world champion, Wilhelm Steinitz, in the 1800s. And it's one of these things that's sort of surprising, because you usually think of the king as a piece that you've got to keep safe behind your own lines, and you don't want to bring it out until late in the endgame. But what Steinitz is saying is that the king actually has a certain amount of fighting power, offensive power, and there are some times when you can actually use your king as a weapon, and that's what I'd like to look at today. Of course, we all know that in the endgame, you can bring your king out and should bring your king out, and that's really when the king comes into its own. But under certain circumstances, you can bring it out even earlier than that. So I think the main thing is you have to be able to guarantee your king's safety, so that even as it marches into your opponent's position, it's not going to be subject to a lot of attacks. So it helps if the queens are off the board, so you have what one could call a queenless middle game. And sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between a queenless middle game, late middle game, or an early end game. These categories all sort of mix together, but in any event, there's several pieces still on the board, but there are no queens around. It also helps if your opponent is so tied down that he isn't able to create any threats against your king, or if you control the key checking squares so that your opponent can't check your king. So as long as some of those circumstances are present, so that your king is not subject to attack, you can sometimes bring it up and make it into a fighting piece. And the advantage of this is that in some circumstances it will be as if you have an extra piece. Some people say that the king has roughly about the same strength as a knight, and so it's kind of like having an extra knight around, or something as strong as a knight. So today I'm going to show you a couple of examples of this. The first example is actually from my most recent tournament game. This was played in September at the Cal Chess Labor Day Open, and it was in the expert section, which I tied for first in. And this was the last round game, so this was a very critical game. My opponent is named Igor Margulis, and he's about a 2100 player, and he's playing black, and I'm playing white. And both sides have just played their 30th move, so we've just passed the time control and have a chance to think again. So as we look at this position, it's clear that my opponent, black, has the better of it. He's got this nice active rook on the 7th rank. His rooks also control the F file. He's got a knight that's also very active. And, of course, he's a pawn up. So for all these reasons, I'm sure that black was thinking in terms of winning this game. Now, if we look at the white position, we can see, first of all, white's rooks are not very active at all. And if white tries to activate his rooks, either of his rooks, he's going to lose a pawn. And so this is certainly a problem for white. On the other hand, there are some good things about white's position. One thing I really liked about this position was that bishop on e6, very aggressively posted, to where if I could get a rook on the 7th rank, the rook and the bishop could combine to put a little bit of pressure on black's position. Also, notice how the bishop controls the square c8, which is going to be very important in the game. And it also kind of, the bishop on e6, the pawn on d5 kind of form a bulwark in the center that black can't break through very easily. And this means that we have a situation where white's king is fairly safe in the center. Black is not able to harass the king very easily with his rook on f8. So the other thing to notice in the position is, that white's king on d3 is fairly active, and in particular, if I can bring it up by going king to c4 and king to c5, that king can participate in advancing the d-pawn and turning the d-pawn into a dangerous threat. So there are some good things for white in this position. And what you should look at is kind of how my play over the next few moves is meant to accentuate these good features of the position. So it's kind of hard to believe right now. Black is certainly stands better, but actually white is going to win the game in not too many more moves. Okay, so the first move I played here was a4, and the reason behind that's straightforward. I'd like to bring my rook to c1, and so I want to move the pawn to a place where it's no longer attacked. And he plays king f6, also a reasonable move. He'd like to activate his king as well. And now I played rook to c1. And now this is an interesting move because there's a sort of obvious threat on the surface, which is my threat to play rook to c7 and fork his two pawns, his pawn on a7 and h7. But there's another point behind this move, which is that it really facilitates the activation of my king, going to c4, c5, c6, and so on. And the reason it does that is that it protects the king from behind, so that black cannot check me on c2, cannot give check from behind the king. And so notice that black cannot check me from either direction on the c file. He can't check on c8 and he can't check on c2. And so this really gives teeth to this plan of mine of activating the king and starts turning the king into a true fighting piece. Okay, now perhaps my opponent's best move would have been something like rook to b8, trying to activate the other rook, and perhaps tempting white into playing rook to c7, which actually would not be a very good move in this position. The reason it's not so good is that black can hit me with the in-between move, rook b3 check. And now notice, if king e4, then white is checkmated immediately. So white would have to go king to c4, and now black can play an x-ray check, a skewer, rook to c2 check, forcing white to go king takes rook, and then black goes rook takes rook. And generally speaking, black is very happy to exchange rooks in this position. First of all, on general principles, when you're ahead in material, you like to exchange down, like to exchange pieces, not pawns. Also, black now controls the c-file, and that cuts white's king off from the support of his d-pawn. So that now black is going to find it very easy to blockade the d-pawn, either with his knight or with his king. And in this position, I think that black is not going to have too much trouble cashing in on his extra pawn. So white should not be tempted to do that. White should, in fact, continue with his plan king c4 in that position. But then black would be able to play rook b2, and now black is able to get in and check the king from behind on c2. And this would have made it more difficult for me to really achieve my plan of activating the king. So instead of rook to b8, which was a fairly tricky move to find, my opponent played rook to f3 check. And what happens here is that he's seduced by the possibility of winning a pawn. So I play king c4, and he plays rook to f4 check. And now we can see what his idea is. He's doing, we have another skewer, this time with the king and the pawn on a4. And I'm sure that my opponent was expecting me to play king to b5 in order to protect the pawn on a4. But this move would be catastrophic for white, because black would now play knight to d4 check. And now the knight turns into a very strong piece. On almost anywhere square white goes to, for example, c5, black would get knight to b3 check, forking the king and rook. Or if the king came back, black would get a discovered check and win white's bishop. So in fact, white's only move is to go king to a6. But then black would have a very easy win after knight takes bishop, pawn takes knight, rook takes pawn, check. And black has won a second pawn and is just in complete control. White's d pawn, which is now an e pawn, is no longer any kind of threat at all. So this would be an example of how not to activate the king, because the king turned into a target of checks here. But instead what I did here was king to c5. And I think my opponent was not expecting that at all. So, of course, white's sacrificing a pawn. But if we look at it, if black takes the pawn, it's very difficult for him to hang on to it. I was going to play rook to a1. And then if black trades rooks, the only way for him to defend the a pawn is to go rook to a8. And now he's got a really awful looking position where his rook is completely passive. And my king has turned into this terror. Okay, I'm now able to go king to c6 with the threat of king b7, winning back my pawn. Now, really about the only answer that black has to this is to play knight to d4 check. But now, this is an interesting position to pause and think about where you would move your king if you were white. So do you move it to b7 and attack the rook? Well, as it turns out, that's not such a great move, because black would now go rook to e8, and now black is kind of righting the ship a little bit. White can take the pawn on a7, but black is going to win a pawn on e6, and so black will still be 2 pawns ahead and have a likely win in the endgame. In fact, he is winning. So king b7 doesn't work so well. Instead, the idea is to sort of remember that to use your pieces together. So the king is especially strong when it can accompany the pawn and really usher that pawn forward. And the king is also particularly strong if he can shut black's king out of the position. And so the best square for white to go to here is actually king to d7. And now the point is, suppose black starts running his pawn with a5. Now white's going to bring his rook over to f1 with check and start chasing black's king out of the picture. You know, how is black going to where is he going to put his king? If he goes to e5, white's just going to keep on checking him. And the black king has got to really move way out of position in order to escape from the checks. And this will then enable white to start pushing his pawn with d6. The other option would be for black to go back with his king to g7, but now white has a good move with rook to d1, putting the question to the knight. And if black goes, say, knight takes bishop, pawn takes knight, basically black now has no good way to stop the advance of white's pawn. Okay, white's threatening just to go e7 and e8 queening. And so really, all that black can do is just check white, harass white with checks. And so we would get a draw by perpetual check. White does not want to back up because then that would enable black to get his king into the action. So we've got basically a situation where neither side can make progress. But of course, a draw is a very good result for white given what the original position was. Okay, so this shows us some of the themes going on in this position and shows that white's very active king is plenty of compensation for the pawn. So even though white is 2 pawns down, that active king, it acts like a second piece, and it gives him enough compensation to be able to draw. Okay, so black looked at this for a long time and finally decided that he couldn't afford to take the a-pawn, and instead he plays the move rook to b8, which perhaps he should have done earlier. Obviously, trying to stop the king's penetration and also trying to activate his other rook. And now notice that rook takes pawn may actually be a possibility for black, because he'll be able to defend his rook with the other rook by playing rook takes a4, followed by rook on b8 to b4. So in this position, I played really, in some ways, my favorite move of the game. I played bishop to d7, and the reason I like this move is that it does so many different things. First of all, it defends the a4 pawn, so it doesn't give black any more chances to snag that pawn. But not only that, it gives this bishop something to do. The bishop, of course, is important because it controls the c8 square. But now the bishop also has another diagonal. It can go to c6 or it can go to b5, where it's going to keep black's rook on b8 out of the game, keep it from infiltrating white's position. Also, the move bishop d7 has another very important point, which is that it frees the pawn on d5 to start advancing, because the pawn is no longer needed to defend the bishop on e6. So this is one of those moves where, the moment I saw it, I just love this move, and it was very hard to kind of sit still and actually analyze the position, because I just really wanted to play this move. And, of course, I think it is good. Okay, so black continues in logical fashion with rook to b2, activating his rook. And now I hit him with another move that I think really surprised him. I played rook to d1 here, once again offering a pawn sacrifice. So, and again, the point is, the key thing to understand about the position is that the a pawn and the h pawn just really aren't that important to white. What really matters is the d pawn. And as long as white can get his pieces active enough, his two rooks, his bishop, and his king, the king counts too, then white has very, very dangerous threats, and it's hard for black to defend. So at this point, I think black is in great danger, and the only way for him to save the game would have been to play rook to f2. And once again, the idea is to get behind the king, to play rook to c2 check, and hopefully trade off a pair of rooks, which will help black defend. But, black was still thinking about winning. He's still under the impression that he's winning this game. And I think that he just, he's getting a little frustrated at having all these pawn sacrifices, and he just can't believe that it all works for white, and so he actually went ahead and took on h2. And now the position is lost for black. So if you want to work out the win by force for white, you can hit the pause button here and see what you would have done. Okay, so the move I played here was bishop takes knight. Now the reason for this move is that if white starts advancing his d-pawn, black is going to have the chance to sacrifice his knight for the d-pawn, and then he'll have 3 pawns for a piece, and will have fairly good drawing chances, especially because white has only 1 pawn left. So the point of bishop takes knight is to eliminate the knight, the last piece of black's that can defend against white's d-pawn. And now black's rooks are amazingly impotent. So for example, if black plays pawn takes bishop, white is just going to go d6, and black has no way to stop the pawn. Notice how important it was for white to have 2 rooks left in the position rather than 1. If white had only 1 rook, black would be winning this game. But because white has both rooks, he's able to put one on the c file where it protects the king from checks. He's able to put the other rook on the d file where it sort of pushes the pawn onto d8. And black is just unable to stop the combined march of the pawn and the king. So again, the point here is that the king can be an active fighting piece as long as the other pieces keep your opponent from checking it. So white here controls all the key squares, and black is unable to check white's king. So instead, black played rook takes bishop, and the idea behind this is to slow down the advance of the d-pawn by pinning it. But it really doesn't help. I simply played king to c6. Oops, sorry. King to c6, and now the pawn is free to advance. Now black played rook to f7, so finally, belatedly, he's got the correct defensive idea of doubling on the 7th rank and bringing the rook in behind the king, but already it's too late. I played d6. And now, the move I was worried about here was actually rook to d7, but this is fine for white. White can just play d7, threatening the queen, and if king to e7, then white can go rook to e1 check. And notice that black cannot cut in front of the pawn because he gets checkmated. So in fact, black has to go back with his king, and white can actually throw in another check. This is a line the computer came up with. Very clever. The point is that, again, if black moves his king toward the pawn, I'm going to play a rook check and force it to d8, and will be checkmated. So black has to go to g7, and now his king is out of play. And white is able to play rook to d1 and queen his pawn. So there's a little bit of computer analysis for you. But in any case, what my opponent played was, instead of rook to d7, he played rook to c7 check. And now the win is very easy for white. I go rook takes rook check, king b7, rook to b2 check, king takes a7, and notice this position is almost like a study, because every piece on the board conspires to keep black's rook from getting back and defending against white's passed pawn. You know, notice how the pawns and the king sort of occupy the F, G, and H files, so black's rook cannot get back that way. If black tries to get back with his rook on the C or the E files, white will push his pawn to D7, and that controls the squares where black would get back on. The king controls the squares B8 and A8, and even white's pawn on A4 plays a role, because that prevents black from playing rook to A2 check and harassing white's king and eventually getting back to the 8th rank that way. So an amazing position where, if you go back a move, even though black was 2 pawns down, he had absolutely no way of stopping the pawn or even sacrificing his rook for the pawn. So a phenomenal position. So in any case, after king takes pawn, black was forced to resign. So a real triumph of white's strategy of activating his king. And the reason that it worked, the reason the king was such a great fighting piece, was that black did not control any squares that he could use to check white's king. And so basically white's king was able to march into the position unimpeded. Now there's one other thing I'd like to mention here, which is that this is move 35, when black played rook to b2. I think his best way to save the game at this point was actually to play king to e7. And the reason for this, well, first of all, it threatens the bishop on d7, so white has got to do something about that. So white could go either to c6 or b5. And then black can play king d6. And the point here is that black is blockading that d pawn. So as long as the pawn is securely blockaded, there's no way that black is going to lose this game. Now white would probably continue with rook to e1 check, but then black can go rook to e4, and then after rook takes rook, knight takes rook, white's king is now no longer, is sort of stymied in its attempt to penetrate black's position, and it has to back up. And now black can fairly easily blockade. Well, let's see. Actually, knight d6 does run into problems with rook c7 check. So, yeah. Okay, yeah, but still knight to d6 is probably the best move. And if white plays rook to c7 check, then yes, white is going to win a pawn on h7 or a7, but then black is going to win a pawn on b5, and we still have a game that should be pretty drawable for black. So in any case, the point I wanted to make here is that black needed to think about how to blockade the d pawn, and also, you know, another point about this is that black has been able to bring his king to a more constructive square. So it turns out that one of the best defenders against a king is another king. And, you know, so what makes a king really effective as a fighting piece is when the other side's king cannot get in there and stop it from advancing. So anyway, just a thought. Okay, I'd like to go on to a second example of how the king can turn into a fighting piece. Now, actually, it was interesting for me to realize as I prepared for this lecture that I've actually already gone over several beautiful examples of this theme in some of my other chess lectures. So if you want to go back to my most recent lecture, or actually second, almost most recent lecture on double queen sacks, the lighter side part 4, double queen sacks. And you'll find that I analyze a game between Kramnik and Leko from 2007, where Kramnik executes a beautiful king march and sets up a mating net with his king against the opponent king. Also another incredibly inspiring Kramnik-Leko game is the last game of their World Championship match from 2004, where again Kramnik is able to use his king as a third fighting piece that is sort of like an extra piece in the position, and so he's able to sacrifice a bunch of pawns, and it doesn't matter because he's got an extra piece. He's got the king, the active king. So if you want to look at that game, it's in my lecture called Tactical Motifs 203, Mating Nets. And finally, another example of a nice fighting king is in the famous game Aljechin versus Yates, which was in my lecture called Strategic Decisions 104, Where Should I Put My Rooks? So it's funny that in each of these lectures the theme was something different, but nevertheless an active king turned out to be a very important ingredient in the game. And maybe this also shows that I just like this theme so much that I'm really attracted to games that have that theme in them. So anyway, those are all some very classical Grandmaster games that have the theme of the fighting king. So since we have a nice selection of Grandmaster games, I wanted to show you another game from my own tournament experience that has the same theme. Okay, so let's look at our second example. This is a tournament game that I played in 1987. It's from the North Carolina Championship. And in fact, that was one of the years that I won the North Carolina Championship, so this was a pretty important game for me. It was actually in an earlier round. My opponent is a player named Marc Cuvillian, or Cuvillian, not sure the correct pronunciation. He was black. And I don't remember what his rating was, whether he's like Class A or expert or what. Maybe even a master, I'm not sure. Anyway, so he's black and I'm white. And this is the position after black's 28th move. So here we have another position that's kind of, a cross between, it's not quite an endgame yet, but it's also kind of, it's a queenless middle game, kind of late in the middle game perhaps. And so we have a position where I think white is pretty happy. White's pieces are all very actively placed. The rook on e1, the rook on h5, and especially the knight on g6 is a great piece, which basically completely ties down black's rook on g8. That rook is unable to go anywhere, and it's just a passive bystander defending the pawn on g7. Also notice that black's pawns, the e6 pawn and the c6 pawn, are, at least for the moment, fairly securely blockaded. So white's got a nice active position, but the question is, how are you going to win this game? because black has all of his weak points, at least for the moment, pretty securely defended. And so the answer is that we need to get another piece into the action, and that piece is my king. Now, in this game, I don't think this example is quite as good as our first example because it wasn't as deliberate. You know, I didn't really set out to activate my king here. It kind of happened by accident. But nevertheless, I think it's a pretty good example of the theme. So the first move I played here, I played rook to h7. And this basically frees up a square for white's king, as we're going to see. Black played king to d7 check. So, of course, white's allowed this discovered check, but it's hardly any kind of threat for black. White escapes the check with king to g4. And black plays bishop d6, and I defend the pawn with c3. Okay, now black plays b6, so he's working towards playing the pawn break c5, which actually is a very good idea for him in this position. And here I played rook to e3. So my idea in this position was to try to lift the rook to f3 and then to f7, and thereby winning the g-pawn. So black's got to do something about this plan, and he plays rook to c8, which also supports the advanced c5, and it also creates a square for his king on e8. So after I played rook f3, he goes king to e8, and once again I have difficulty penetrating the position. So at this point I got a little bit frustrated. I probably should play king to h5 right away, but instead I played rook to e6. And if black wants, he could actually try for repetition of position with king to d7. But he actually feels as if he has a better square than that for his king, and he plays king to f7 instead. And now, as I said, I kind of am forced into this idea of activating my king with king to h5. Now, here I think black's still got a perfectly playable game. He should definitely, in this position, have played c5, this break that he's been setting up for several moves. And if he does that, I think that he's in perfectly good shape. But instead, he played sort of an aimless move, rook to c7. And I'm not really sure why. I think maybe he was just trying to give extra protection to his pawn on g7. And maybe he's also preparing to bring his other rook over to c8 and double the rooks on the c file and sort of increase the pressure behind the break c5. But unfortunately, this move overlooks a nice trick of white's. So I played knight to h8 check, which is a really cute move. You very seldom see a knight moving all the way to the corner like this. But it turns out that it's just the move that I needed in order to drive his king away from the good defensive square at f7. So remember how I said in our last example that very often the best defender against a king is the opposing king. And that was certainly true in this case. But now that black's king is going to be forced away from f7, white's king is going to be able to walk into g6, and then once again it'll be as if white has an extra piece, an extra attacking piece. So black plays king e7. What else can he do? And black plays king to g6. And now we finally have answered the question of how we're going to put extra pressure on black's position. So now the threat is rook takes g7 check. So at this point, there's not that much that black can do about that. So he tries to sort of complicate things with the move bishop to f4. And of course, one good point about this move is that it threatens the pawn on g5. So white's king actually can't go forward any farther, or else white would lose the pawn. Nevertheless, white probably can win fairly straightforwardly with rook to f3. Now, I didn't play this move, and it's, I think, because I wasn't able to calculate all of the complications after bishop d2. But in fact, this does work out in white's favor. After rook to f7 check, king d8, rook takes rook, king takes rook, and now king to f7 is a very strong move. So if black plays rook to d8, then white is able to play king takes e6, bishop takes pawn, rook takes pawn check, and now what happens is that actually black's king gets into trouble because of white's very active pieces. So after, say, king to b8, white goes knight to g6, and the threat is knight to e7 with a really killing check on c6. So if you go over this with the computer, it gives white a big advantage. But this was an awful lot to work out, and I just didn't have that kind of confidence over the board. So instead I played a somewhat more cautious move, rook to e2, and this ended up working out fine because my opponent then played king to d6, and I played knight to f7 check, and this cuts off black's rook from the defense of the g-pawn, so that now after, well, if the king moves back, white's just going to win the pawn on g5. And so black in desperation goes rook takes knight, king takes rook, but after rook takes e6 check, he was forced to resign. So a very pretty finish. I love the move knight to a8, knight to h8, but what really set it all up was the penetration of white's king to g6. And what made that possible was the fact that black's position was so passive that he had no way to harass white's king. And so when you have that kind of position where your opponent is just tied down and can't do anything, a lot of times the king can be that extra piece that you need to break down his position. And certainly black should not have lost this game. The problem was that he was not aggressive enough, did not play c5 and start forcing white to defend on the queen side, so that this gave white complete carte blanche to penetrate on the king side. Okay, so just remember the king is a fighting piece. Don't be afraid to bring it into the action, especially in the end game, but even in a late middle game where your opponent is very tied down, or where you can prevent your opponent from harassing your king, you can then turn the king into essentially an extra piece. So I hope you learned something today, and for chesslecture.com, this is Dana Mackenzie signing out.